Buenas tardes, bienvenue, welcome to the Inclusive Rigor workshop. I'm thrilled that you are here with us. We're going to be examining different combinations of participatory learning methods in the context of peace building. This is a workshop setting, so we have a really exciting group of facilitators that are with us today. We have Alamusa Dioma from MRAP, the Malian Institute for Action Research on Peace. We have Edwin Cuillos from Everyday Peace Indicators. We have Tiffany Frary of Photo Voice and also a fellow at King's College London. We have Livia Rohrbach from Search from Common Ground, Ayak from 641M Network in South Sudan, Ellen Bradburn from Interpeace, Marina Apgar from Institute for Development Studies, Angela Baez and Steve Gray from Adapt Peacebuilding, and myself and Corey Walsh, who's behind the scenes from Humanity United. So we're thrilled that you're here. It's an eclectic group of M&E gurus and learning enthusiasts, and we're here to discuss what it means to have inclusive rigor and what that concept is. Before we dive in, I just want to make sure, I wanted to share how we're planning the next 70 minutes. We're going to have a time of presenting an evolving framework around inclusive rigor and 4 different case studies from Mali, Colombia, and South Sudan. At the end of those presentations, this is the meat of what we'll be grappling with in the breakout rooms. When we get into the breakout rooms, we're setting them up to have them in English, Spanish, and French. And so right now, what you'll see in the chat is a Google sheet where you can go in and write your name under which language you prefer. That way, Corey, who's behind the scenes, will be setting up the groups so that you can go in and really wrestle with the content in what you feel most comfortable with. So we have a mix of all the facilitators in these groups. So everyone will be working with the same questions, but with a different pair of facilitators. So again, please go into the chat, click on the Google sheet and add your name to the language preference that you have. All right. So with that, where we are today, the reason we're together is that peace building, as we know, has a dual challenge of operating in complex situations, and gathering evidence around that has always been a challenge. We've come at this, it's known that peace building doesn't have the same type of evidence base that other fields have. But why is that? And how do we grapple with the fact that we don't have set in stone linear ways of just creating peace? Well, we know that peace is not just the absence of violence. We know that peace is about shifting underlying dynamics. And so how we gather and learn with each other, with different actors, on how we are seeing change happen, what's the best framework or combination of frameworks and methodologies in order to do that. So that's how we get to complexity-aware M&E for peace building. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Marina Apgar to present a little bit more on the framework.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Hello, everyone. I'm Marina Apgar. As Leslie said, I'm based at the Institute of Development Studies. And yeah, super excited to be here with everybody. So a lot of my work focuses on methodological innovation in impact evaluation, particularly interested in how we bring together learning-oriented and participatory methods with ones that enable us to navigate complexity. And so what I'm going to do is share briefly with you some thinking which is evolving. So we're not presenting a sort of polished framework, but rather presenting our thinking to date as we look across all the different experiences that we have in this group, and you'll hear about the different cases, in ways that we are trying to practice what we're calling inclusive rigor. So why are we talking about reconceptualizing or rethinking or perhaps an even more radical way, reclaiming, if you like, the idea of rigor? So this is because in the world of evaluation, the way in which rigor is used and conceptualized, which then, of course, influences methodologically what we do and influences what we can understand from our M&E systems, is in many ways set in certain views of how knowledge is generated and what evaluation does, which we would argue are not fit for purpose. So as Leslie has explained, we need approaches that can help us to navigate the complexity of peace building. So what we need is to think about shifting from only using counterfactual causal logics to embracing multiple forms of knowledge. And that's why we need participatory approaches. We also need to think about how we mix methods. So moving away from designs that are only about single methods and, if you like, the right way to do evaluation, which is often very methodologically driven, but to think about ways in which we combine and recombine methods. And to do this well, we need to be able to adapt and innovate, which means we're not just implementing designs as they were originally conceived, but in fact, we're always thinking about how we stay focused on what's fit for purpose in any given moment. And this means, more importantly, that we, and this is perhaps the hardest shift to make, is that we need to see ourselves, those of us who are working in the M&E space, as facilitators of learning, rather than external judges of performance, which is kind of the sort of classic way of thinking about evaluation. So given all of this, we've been playing around with different ways in which we can think about quality in our work that aligns with what works in conditions of complexity. And what we've been playing around with builds on a lot of thinking of many people. So it's not all purely our own. So examples here of some of the papers published in the last 7 years from people who are both in the academic and scholarly space, but also in the practice of evaluation, thinking about rigor from a participatory perspective. So Robert Chambers's work on inclusive rigor, and that's kind of the idea that we're taking forward, but also work that's explored criteria for adaptive rigor, or rigor for adaptive and politically aware programs. So what does this look like for us? And this is really where we'd like to engage with all of you in the discussions in the breakout rooms. What we've done is essentially synthesized across some of those frameworks and have been thinking about this in the context of our own work, our own practice. And so what we offer here, as I said earlier, is sort of a framework in development. So at the center of the way in which we can understand the practice of inclusive rigor are 3 domains. So the 3 circles you see in the center of the diagram. And these are 3 domains through which we can see how our M&E practice is operationalized. First, in blue, is the methodological domain. So this is the ways in which we make decisions about mixing different methods and how effective those mixes are. In the green, we have the domain of participation, if you like. It's where our practice can enable different forms of knowledge and different stakeholders to be included in a meaningful way. So that's about the who in the process. And then in the red, in the third domain, that's really about the ultimate goals, right? The utilization of evidence and learning that we generate. And through that, what we can actually understand in terms of how change happens. And it links to the need to engage with the views and desires and the learning needs, if you like, of multiple stakeholders. So to use this framework in our own reflections, we've articulated some questions which are in the boxes around, the colored boxes. So linked to the methodological domain would be the question of how are we combining and recombining methods in a particular context to ensure critical reflection and optimize learning and adaptation. In the participation domain, we might ask ourselves, how do we optimize participation and inclusion through our methods and processes and mindsets in order to stay focused on local needs? So how can we be responsive to those local needs? And in terms of the utilization, we would ask ourselves, how do our methods and practices respond to learning needs of multiple stakeholders within and beyond the project? And of course, these domains sit within our decisions around the play out in a larger environment, which is depicted by the enabling environment in orange, which includes the politics of how decisions about the how, the who, and the why are made. And there are two aspects in particular to the enabling environment which are useful to think about. On the one hand, we have the institutional dynamics that are linked to partnerships and relationships. So how we set up in our programs and in our M&E systems, and what are our relationships, including our donors. And on the other hand, we have a focus on the qualities and competencies of the M&E teams, in particular, the ways in which we can be reflexive, innovative, and open-minded. Yeah? And so working in ways that support being inclusive and methodologically sound, right, isn't simply about ensuring that each of these pieces works, but it's also about thinking about the tensions that we encounter within and across these different domains. Because really, this is not as though we're presenting a different new view of rigor that you simply just go away and implement, but rather it's ways of thinking about the tensions that we encounter and the challenges we face. And that's what my colleagues are going to now bring to life through examples from our work. So I think I'm handing over to Edwin, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Marina, so much. Welcome, everybody. My name is Edwin. I work with the Everyday Peace Indicator team, and I'm very happy to share this space with you. My English isn't the best, but I'll do my best to communicate with you, okay? I look forward to all your questions and comments in the working groups that we will hold after these talks. I will start by quickly introducing our work combining two participatory methodologies with big teams communities in Colombia, Everyday Peace Indicators and Participatory Photography, or Photo Voice. And then we will share some learning that we see it as opportunities and tension that will contribute to the discussion on the process of monitoring, evaluation, and peace building. First, the Everyday Peace Indicators is a new approach to understanding and tracking changes in hard-to-measure concepts like peace, reconciliation, governance, and violent extremism. Instead of developing indicators of success using expert or scholar, we work with communities themselves to establish their own everyday indicators, which are then measured in order to evaluate change in that community's vision of peace. This methodology is combined with Photo Voice, a qualitative and creative proposal that expands the narrative of the most voted indicators based on images and testimonials. Its results provide important elements for the visual analysis of the representation of everyday peace in terms of coexistence and justice, but it also produces an important social impact on the communities, amplify their voices to new audience, make their needs visible to policymakers, make unconventional photo exhibition in communities, among others. Next slide, please. In this context, we have identified an element that we consider a great opportunity within the domain of inclusive rigor. This is the affective dimension that sustains participatory work, improves its results, and links community with external facilitators. More than a risk of bias, we consider an advantage to promote social transformation, qualify community dialogue, and humanize the work of monitoring and research. Photography allows people to connect with their memory, their experience, and their emotions. The affective is the effective. Next slide, please. But we also find two tensions that may be future opportunities. The first ones consist in the dilemma of carrying out open and inclusive process in violent contexts. In Colombia, illegal armed actors continue to operate, have a presence and control in communities. There can be situations in which participatory community activities are filtered and observed by illegal armed actors who attend activities in even affect or influence community decision-making. Inclusive rigor process must be evaluated by social leaders and local organizations to minimize the risk of corruption by illegal groups. What are the limits of inclusion? Can participation put communities at a risk in violent contexts? Next slide, please. Finally, we find a second tension on using photo voice to communicate community priorities to national and international audience. Community photography doesn't always generate images and text that are easy for national and international audience to understand. This audience might need a better explanation of the context, cultural particularities, localism, historical context, etc., to understand the significance and the messages that the community photographers want to communicate. This can create a tension around whether photo voice projects prioritize community of the outsider audience. Inclusive rigor required adequate contextualization in order to be inclusive of community as well as national and international audience. It is a challenge to achieve inclusive participation while also creating outputs that translate effectively to wider audience who don't have an understanding of the local context. Thank you.
I'll just go straight ahead then. Thank you, Edwin, and present the case of a systemic action research project for community-driven peacebuilding in Mali that is implemented jointly by the four organizations that you see in the slide on your screen. So the Vestibule de la Paix project, as it is known, attempts to work directly, putting the communities in the driving seat of first collecting evidence, but also using this evidence to launch community-based projects for conflict resolution and enhance peace in their communities and beyond. The project also has ambitions to use the data collected by the communities and by the rest of the project team to really learn from the methodology and how it works, and also has the ultimate goal to really influence the wider peacebuilding field by using this community-generated evidence. So to focus in more on what we do in terms of monitoring evaluation for this, thank you, Leslie. So in terms of MEL design, the particularity of this project, well, there are many, but one of them is that really the learning objective, the learning questions, and even a wider in-depth discussion about what the results, the expected changes of this project were really devised collaboratively with the rest of the team. Because the partnership is composed of very different organizations that participate at different levels in the project, everyone's expectations and ambitions for what the data was going to be used for were quite diverse. And the process of really getting all those ambitions together and narrowing them down to a list of learning questions was a really important one at the start of the project. Similarly, I mean, when I say that the project really in terms of M&E, everything was to be built at the start of the project, it also led us to really think about the methodologies and the tools that we wanted to use as a second step after we really devised, well, what we were trying to get out of this data, what was going to be more for learning and what was going to be more for evaluation and so on. So while we use broadly a theory-based evaluation approach and tools like outcome harvesting and so forth, these are really highly adaptable and used only in the context of those learning questions that we're trying to answer. As I mentioned, a particularity of how this was set up was really that it was very collaborative and participatory within the team. There is an M&E team that is dedicated to doing this work, but it's the project of conceiving really the ambitions and the broad lines of this work was really done collaboratively with the team. So this is just one example of the kind of bricolage that we did, trying to gather the appropriate data and really embed the data collection in the project. And this is done in this example through real-time documentation, very in-depth, very qualitative, of the different action research groups that are active in the communities. And this data, so the framework was designed by the M&E team, but the data is collected by the project team members and very closely with the participants, which if we think back on the framework, really poses that question of, if we want to be highly inclusive and participatory, is there a point where that becomes too much of a weight on participants? And how do we connect that with our own data utilization objectives? Another particularity of this project is how we attempted to foster a culture of reflection and adaptation in the project. And there are two main ways that we do this. One is at the project level. We have systematized the use of after action reviews that really create the space to reflect upon our practices on the operational level, but also really on the ethical level, thinking about inclusion and participation, and also on the strategic level, thinking really what are we seeing that enables us to maybe adapt along the way, depending on the needs and the reality of the data that we're collecting. And another key thing is that the partnership itself is quite peculiar and is an explicit element of our MEL work. The structure of the partnership and the characteristics that we define as a partnership are essential for successful collaboration. That is in of itself an objective of our MEL work. And we use the rubric tool that you can see on the slide to commonly define the areas that are well-functioning, emerging, and need more work. Evaluate whether partnership is along those lines, and what to do to continuously make it better. Which also really goes back to the wider, the orange bigger circle in the slides before, where we talk about the enabling environment that really creates this culture of self-reflection and critical learning and decision on adaptations. That's it for me. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to take over and spend a couple of minutes talking about the South Sudan program. We also have Ayak here with us, who will be leading one of the breakout sessions as well. A few words on the program. So basically, the program is really innovative in the way that it tries to transform the traditional top-down approaches that are so inherent to many of the donor and beneficiary relationships in our field. Instead, we engage young South Sudanese peace leaders and peace builders across ethnic and geographic and gender lines. As you can see here on the slide in the diagram, at the very core of the work is the concept of accompaniment, so walking alongside each other, both as implementers, but also as young peace builders on the ground. The Cohort 0 is our operado, like how we operate as an implementing partnership. It unites a small network of people from a very wide range of backgrounds and cultures and professional experiences. So I'm one of the members, Search for Common Ground, who's leading in the learning part of it. We have Anyok Foundation, who introduced a very novel approach to accompaniment. And then we have HiveMind Institute, who brings in a more of a network approach to the program. At the same time, next to this cohort 0, as we call it, we also have the smaller cohorts of South Sudanese peacebuilders on the ground, who together build trust and awareness in these cohorts, and then share a vision for a future South Sudan and implement activities on the ground. Connected to this whole idea of accompaniment is also a bigger thinking in terms of networks. So both for cohort 0 in terms of trying to shift the way we think about peace building, and also for the cohorts on the ground, so the local peace builders, to get to expand their networks and try to collaborate more across. So in terms of learning and monitoring evaluation, what we have adopted, especially in cohort 0, is a very emergent learning strategy that accommodates the divergent needs and upcoming and changing needs, which then very much beyond the linear model that is so common in monitoring, evaluation, and learning. What I mean by this is that we do a bit of this methodological bricolage that we're going to talk more about later, by mixing methods and using different data sources. One of them is, for example, WhatsApp data. One is relational survey data, so kind of more of a social network approach. Another one is outcome harvesting. Yet another one is one-on-one conversations and kind of like more of an interview style. Now going to the tensions. I want to set us up a little bit for the breakout sessions by already pointing out a little bit some of the tensions that come up in the work we do in South Sudan. So one of the tensions, tension 1 here, is between kind of ensuring utilization and impact, and then participation and inclusivity. So basically for us, one of the big tensions that we face again and again is how do we set ourselves up to be consistent while at the same time designing MEL processes that are inclusive and participatory and in the end of most use for the local peace builders in South Sudan. So basically the question here is, or the challenge that we face is that we want to speak to change that happens over a very long time period, which requires adaptation along the way. And we also want to be able to share learning more widely, right? But then the question that kind of flows from that is, how does an M&E process need to look like in order for people to actually be able to consistent about it? So how do we make it useful? How do we design it in a way that it can be used and be most useful, not for necessarily the cohort 0, the implementing partnership, but the young South Sudanese peace builders who we want to reflect back the learning that we see. Another tension, and I'm only going to focus on 2 here now in the interest of time, more in the breakout room, is the third one that you can see here, which kind of evolves around, again, utilization impact, the methodological bricolage, and then our very unique partnership that we have in cohort 0. So basically, in the cohort approach that we have, we bring together, as I said before, a very diverse range of people with different lived experiences and also different notions of learning, which then forces us to critically reflect on the methods we use and the approaches we use. But then also we want to be kind of like, consistent about it at the same time. So I think what is challenging for us then is to actually deal with the tensions that arise by the different understandings of the notion of learning and what is most useful. And then intentionally kind of creating more of a bridge between individual learning and learning as a group. So kind of disentangling these different, usefulness of MEL processes. I'm going to leave it here, and I hope to continue the conversation more in the breakout room. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm Stephen Gray. I'm here with my colleague, Angela, and we're going to talk about a program in Colombia. Just to let you know that I am the final speaker for tonight. So after this, we're going to have breakout groups, If you haven't signed up for a breakout group yet, I think a Google Doc was sent as a link in the chat. Please do that, and please start thinking about all the wonderful things that you'd like to say. So as for our example, this program is a program in Colombia working through peace councils in 3 locations. The peace councils, generally speaking, act as a space or bridge between the Colombian government and the people, particularly in the territories most affected by conflict. And they are, since the signing of the peace agreement in 2016, a space that is helping to move forward the implementation of the provisions there. So this program uses 2 different approaches to supporting the peace councils. One is a more traditional capacity development and dialogue approach. The second approach is systemic action research, which you've already heard a little bit about, which is more participatory, learning orientated, and adaptive. In terms of the learning that is accompanying this program, what it's doing is comparing those 2 approaches, and it's asking which has which kind of reactions in relation to power dynamics. That's one of our research questions. And the second is how are different types of relationships activated, engaged, or transformed depending on which peacebuilding methodology that are used. And the methods that we're using is kind of a blend of process tracing and outcome harvesting. So outcome harvesting functions to capture the changes by these processes of engaging with the peace councils. And the process tracing is really helping us to connect the dots between why those changes happened and how those causal pathways are connected. Next slide, please. So looking at this version of the diagram that you've already seen that focuses on the domains of inclusive rigor, our interpretation of that, one way to say it would be that for us, there's a kind of a hierarchy between the why are we learning about in or about this program and who is involved in it, and then how do we actually learn. So for us, that why is the dominant driving factor. And from that point, it implicates who needs to be involved and when they need to be involved. And the how, the methods that you use and the bricolage that you arrive at and how that's adapted to the context is relatively flexible, but it needs to kind of meet those other 2 conditions. So just kind of unpacking that a little bit more on the next slide. Another way that we can examine that relationship between the why and the who of the learning is it's not so much a tension as it is an interdependency, which is synergistic, but has some implications. So the why are we learning, the kind of core priority relates to the participants that are in the councils themselves. So what do they need to learn throughout the process to make their actions in dialogue or outside of the dialogue process more effective in the peace building outcomes that they're trying to achieve? So that's kind of the core priority, and it suggests a certain group that needs to be considered quite early on in terms of how you do the learning, what you're learning about, and what you're using it for. The second layer of why is really about the institutional environment that sits around these peace councils. So that is the Colombian government, locally and nationally. It's donors that might be supporting this program. It's civil society organizations or other organizations that might be kind of key players in the context. So their perspectives are integrated into the learning, and we also try to be mindful of what they need to know for the purpose of buying into the process and the current program, and also thinking about the next version or scale up of the program. What do they think needs to happen? And then the final layer of that is you guys, if you will. So it's about this wider discourse that we are having about what constitutes effective peace building, what really works and what doesn't, and why. And maybe to flip the whole paradigm on its head from how we usually or other approaches to rigor would do it, that kind of capital T truth about what the best peace building is probably the third priority for us. So that all relates to who's participating and you see the groups listed there that we involve. The only points that I'd make about that is that it's not just who participates, but when. So it's interesting to consider the participants in your program. Were they involved in the design of your learning, like what you're learning about, how you're learning it, or do they only get included when you've already designed the whole thing? And the same for donors. Like, are they included before, at all, during, or only after, when you present your results and say how amazing what you did was? So the when matters as well. And then the last point is that if you're trying to integrate that many perspectives in this wider inclusive way, so it's not just participants, but it's the enabling environment and the organizations that sit around that, that helps you do systems change, but it takes more time, and you need to have a lot of trust in the organizations that are supporting you to do this work, because it's it's resource intensive. Thank you very much. So I think I'll hand over before we go to breakout rooms.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you to everyone. We are now going to move into our work together in groups. I'm thrilled that we can do this. So we're going to open up the breakout groups. Several of you have signed up for the groups. I just want to remind you, when you get put into the groups, if it's not the language that you want, you are able to choose another group. You will also be able to go back out to the big room, and Corey and Jessica will be able to help us get you into that group. So we are going to come back at 35 minutes past the hour to wrap up for 10 minutes. And so get ready to enjoy really grappling with all these concepts. But so right now we're just going to turn to each of the groups to do one larger readout, the complete opposite of a readout, but just a takeaway that you want to share, one takeaway from your conversation to bring back to the room before we close. So I will turn first to Hélène.
Thank you, Leslie. Yes. I was just about to ask the main question I wanted to ask when it all got closed down. But I think for us, a thing that was really key in the conversation is when we talk about rigor and when we talk about inclusivity, the key element was really for us to rethink who we're putting in the center, or what we're putting in the center of this, and that actually the participating populations could be more front and center and could be more involved in participatory processes, and that would actually advance inclusive rigor maybe more than anything else, because it's for them that it's important, and what do we do with this data, that's for them to decide, really, or it should be.
Excellent. So bringing the community at the defining rigor with the community, that's wonderful. Great. With that, I will turn it over to el grupo en español, Edwin and Angela.
I think that we actually didn't have enough time to get to a final conclusion, but I think that there were like a few questions that are really, really important to continue asking ourselves. One was about it was Irene who was pointing out this, and is communities are sometimes exhausted of us gathering information. So we have to keep moving how to articulate our processes of intervention with the opportunities of learning, so they don't feel that they have been used to gather a lot of information for a lot of times. Other of the aspects that one of them mentioned was about honesty, because the way in which we are going to design these conversations with the people are going to affect the way in which they are willing or not to say if what they found most valuable or not. So that was like another point that they made. And the final was regarding resources and timing, because this is something that is very structural, But to do this kind of approaches, open to adapt, requires this like space that is willing to adapt and to invest a lot of resources in the melt process.
Great points. Thank you, Angela. I will turn it over to the English #1 group, Marina and Steve.
Thanks, everyone. I can share one idea, Steve, then you can add thoughts if you'd like to. We had a really interesting discussion. I think we focused a little bit more on kind of who we are in the process. And we talked about how it really isn't about methods, but it's about the values, the quality in our thinking. We talked about critical reflexivity, and essentially the competencies and qualities that we bring into the process that enables us to implement inclusive rigor. And yeah, I thought there was a mention of the term empathy, which is a bit of a obsession of mine at the moment, of thinking about empathy as central to participatory processes in general. Steve, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else.
You summed it up beautifully, Marina. We'll pass it on to the next group.
Great. Tiffany, Livia, Ayak.
Maybe I can just get...
All right, Ayak. Ayak or Tiffany?
Go ahead, Tiffany.
Yeah, I can step in because Livia's sound is... So, where do I start? We talked a lot about tensions actually, and we were exploring kind of different methods. I mean, a couple of key points that came up was the importance of context and also of time. So we were. It'd be great actually for anyone else to chip in, or Olivia, for you to put, because I know you are much more focused on the note taking. But there were various. This tension's basically about attending to different diverse stakeholders, but also we talked about the demands that participation puts on community members, and we heard about different methods that might be inclusive but less demanding in terms of time, which was super interesting. I'm going to stop there because I'm slightly blabbering, and I was relying on Livia's beautiful summary.
Right. But I'm back now, I think. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Tiffany. So we discussed a lot. It was really interesting. And I think the echo that we heard was context is everything. So we were talking about how, depending on the context, being inclusive means something different. And then one method might work better in one context than the other. That was kind of one thing. And one of the other important things I think that came through in our conversations was about, kind of who it should be useful for. So this kind of like receiver of the learning and what we want to bring forward. So how do we manage to make it relevant for the people that actually should, make use of it and benefit from the learning that we create and the learning we share back.
Wonderful. I'm just thrilled. Because this conversation is going to end in 1 minute, but it's going to continue because we are committed, the group of facilitators here, we're committed to sharing out this evolving framework that we have. We're going to be capturing the key takeaways from the different breakout groups and the questions around each of the domains. And we will have that in English, Spanish, and French for now for this group. I think there were a lot of ideas of exchanges between the different programs from the participants in the small groups, how you can share your insights and questions about this. We want to invite you into this conversation. I'll put my email in the chat, or Corey, if you could do that for me right now, that would be great. And yeah, promise to share out in some way. We'll work with, maybe we could do that on the AFP website or something as a place to share this out with you all after this session. So again, I want to thank Corey. I want to thank Jessica from behind the scenes, allowing us to work on this particular platform to get us into these different groups. There's a lot of learning just in how we set this up that we'll be taking forward. So again, thank you, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon, evening.